And welcome. This tutorial is all about appearances. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And again, doesn't matter really what size it is. I'm just going to use this 1280 by 1024 preset. I have it set to pixels. I'm just going to go ahead and create that. This tutorial, we're going to look at the appearance options. And what appearance is really how the stroke, how the fill looks on each of your shapes. And there's a lot of different tools that we have and things we can do to make really complex appearances and kind of beautiful artwork within these tools. So to start with, let's go ahead and create a shape. I'm going to go ahead and use a polygon tool. I'm just going to make a hexagon. Remember, if for some reason, like the last time I used this, it was set to triangle, so I just have to hit the up arrow until I get to 6 sides. I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift so it snaps to being essentially horizontal like this, and then let go. And now what we did previously is we just chose a solid color and a solid stroke, and we talked a little bit about some of the options you had here in terms of some of the stroke settings, but we didn't get very deep into this process. So to start with, let's just set a solid color. And then we'll have the stroke weight. Let's just have it be 10 points so it's really visible. And we're going to leave it black for now. It doesn't really matter. So we've got our shape. We've got our solid fill color. This is great, right? So there are other ways we can work. There are other things we can do instead of a solid fill. So let's start with our fill. So within the fill, right, we've been using the swatches. I told you this is also an option where you can just sort of do a color picker and find a color that you're interested in using. The next one up is the gradient tool. And the gradient tool allows you to choose different types. As soon as I click on anything in here, it will allow me to apply a gradient. And currently this gradient is just black to white, right? And this is actually a radial gradient. If I was to move the center point here, and you'll see that it popped open the gradient tool as well. So with the gradient tool, if I adjust this, although this looks like it's linear for some reason, it is linear. I'm not sure why. When I chose the radial, there we go. I don't know. It went back to linear. Maybe I selected it again. So, right, so this is a radial gradient, linear gradient, and then this other gradient option basically allows you to select different points and adjust the color of each of these different points, which is really useful, right? I can make that bright red, right? There's a lot of interesting things that can happen here, and I can adjust, where that point is. There's a lot of really cool things you can do with this. It's one of their newer settings, but let's start by just doing a linear gradient, a radial gradient inside this box. And so, right, this tool that we have up is a mirroring of this tool here. And you'll see that right now, this center point is selected, right? And now I've selected this outer point. And then there's this little diamond. The diamond says basically how quickly should it fade from one color to the other, right? Now, something to note, if you click down here where there's nothing, you'll see the plus sign shows up. That's going to add another point on the gradient. Right now, we're just going to deal with 2. If you accidentally add one, you can just pull that off by dragging down and releasing, and it'll snap it away. You can also trash it. If there's like a third, like if I have a third one, I can also just hit that trash can and get rid of it. Okay, so I can adjust this to adjust how quickly that transition happens. I can also move these on the line, right? So if I wanted this to be really bright white until a certain point and then fade to black, I can do that. When I have one of these selected, one of the things that I can do is I can choose the color for this particular point. So if I double click on this point, it'll pop open this little dialog, which is going to allow me to choose color again. I can choose it here. I can set a value. I can go to my swatches and say choose purple or something like that. And now I've got this really nice gradient fill. I can do the same thing for the other point. I can double click and say, oh, let's make it go to green. That's probably going to be weird, but whatever. Right, and again, I can do all those same settings here. So I can adjust that setting there. I can double click on this to open that up. I can also drag this over here, right? Or I can pull the green in a little bit. And then there's just a couple other settings. This one allows me to make it more oval in shape, right? So I can actually have this gradient be set like that. And then this allows me to scale the entire thing larger or smaller, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm just, if I want that to just be a tiny, tiny point in the middle, I could do that, or I could make it so the green is almost barely visible on the sides of this. And again, if I want to add an additional point, I can select one here, and then I can very quickly make it a very different color. And I can also select this, right, and adjust this, and you can get really amazing and gorgeous effects based on how you set these up. If I pull this in a little bit closer, right, now I've got this like glowing purple orb that's backlit by some crazy cyan color on a green field, right? And it really gives it a kind of interesting appearance. Okay, so I can do gradients, right? Let's go ahead, and I'm really happy with that, so let's go ahead and create a different shape. I'm just going to do a rectangle this time. And you'll note that, right, because that's the settings that I had last, it's going to put that in there, which is kind of cool. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and go over to one other option, which is our pattern. Now, this is actually a prompt to describe the pattern you want to generate. This is using some of the AI tools that are in here. I could just say red flowers on black background. And I haven't actually typed this in before. I have no idea what it's going to look like. I'm going to suggest, if you're taking my class, we don't really use this, or we talk about how to use it effectively, just because I want you to learn how to do the other tools rather than just using whatever the AI engine spits out at you, right? So in this case, right, there are 3 options that it generated that would allow me to make a choice from any of those. And so, right, so that's one way to add a pattern. There are other options as well. So let's go ahead and see what we can do. If I go to my swatches panel, and instead of using AI, I come down here. Anytime you see these little books on a shelf, that's what that icon is, just as a heads up. That means that there's libraries that you can use of things that are built into And so some of these are solid colors, but they also have this patterns option, which has several different things. And so there's basic graphics, there's decorative, and there's nature. Like if you need some leopard print, this is where you go for the leopard print, and foliage and things like that. We're going to start with the basic graphics, and we're just going to go ahead and start with dots. Right? We're going to get really exciting with dots. And so I have this selected, and if I just, as long as this object is selected and I choose dots, right, I can choose any, right, one of these dot setting that I want. This one is like a gradient from narrow to thick, right? There's, lines of gradients of thickness, So just choose a dot pattern that you're interested in, something that doesn't fill every pixel, like not really that, but some of these other ones will work for this example. So we've got these dots, but it's kind of annoying that we just have dots and it's black on a white background, and there's no option to choose anything with color in here, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to start using the power of the appearance panel to change some of that. And so what we can do is we come over here, and there's this icon here that's a dot with a dashed line around it. That's our appearance option. If I open that up, you're going to see basically the same thing that's here is here, and more or less the same thing that's up here is down here, right? If I click on the word stroke, I get that same dialog up with all the options there. I want you to note that the stroke and the fill both have opacity options. And then finally, there's an opacity for the entire object, right? So if I just did this opacity to 50%, right, everything's going to kind of go gray. But if I was to just do the fill opacity to 50%, right, you can see that goes gray, but that boundary is still 100%, right? So we have those options. I also want you to note that there's 3 icons down here. One is a stroke, and one is fill, and one is an effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by adding a new fill. So if I click on this, right, now I have 2 fills, and what it does is whatever your previous fill was, it just does the exact same thing. And I want you to note that this fill is on top of the stroke, which is on top of the other fill. So if I change this to, say, red, you're going to see that my stroke width looks like it's about half as thick because this is actually laying on top of my stroke. If I want to adjust that, I can just click in this blue area, drag this down, and now, right, the red is underneath. But hopefully you can already see some of the power of this, right? Because I can adjust the opacity of each of these fill layers independently, I could change this to, say, multiply. And now I've got a red field with black dots as my fill. Similarly, if I don't want to just use, like, say, red, let's say I actually want to do a gradient here. And let's go ahead and just select the gradient that we had, right? I've got this set to multiply in 100%. So now my gradient is also, right, working with this opacity, with this object. Now, what if I want to adjust the scale of this center circle here, right? Like I actually want that to be filling the space a little more. To do that, I want to make sure I have this selected, and then I'm going to go over here, and this is the gradient tool. So what this does is basically if you have a gradient applied, it's just going to pop up this tool on top of it so you can make adjustments. And so I'm going to go ahead and go to this dot here, which is the scale. And I'm just going to pull this thing up and scale the entire thing up a little bit, right? Okay. Now this is making my brain hurt a little bit because of the way it's set. And you'll note that where I'm at right now, this appearance panel has changed, right? All this is doing is this color stop is what these dots are called that adjust the color, is what's available right now in the appearance panel. So I could change my fill color here, right? I could change this to, say, yellow or something like that, which I don't necessarily want to do. But then, right, it's still, this panel's still open, but this is what's up right now. Okay, so if I go back to my selection tool, then the appearance panel changes back to the object I have selected. And so in this case, let's say I don't want to do multiply. Let's say I want to change this to screen or something like that, right? So now you can see I'm getting a much different effect based on this. I can do overlay as well. That softens the black a little bit, but it's still present. And again, I can do, right, all sorts of different changes here. I can adjust how opaque these things are. I can also go to normal and just completely block that layer underneath. Similarly, let's go ahead and just drag this and switch the order and see what we get, right? So the first thing I want you to note is that this is actually not black and white, it's black and transparent, right? And so I've just got these black dots on top of here. Again, now I could just adjust this opacity down, right, to make those lighter or darker. I could do a difference on this, which is, going to change the colors a little bit, not too much. Right, I could do color dodge, right? There's lots of different ways that I could interact with these things to create pretty complex things. And I've got 2 layers now. There's no reason why I couldn't add a third. Let's say I want to have like a gradient that fades the entire thing from top to bottom. I can create another thing. You'll notice it defaulted to whichever one I just had selected. And instead of this gradient that I've been using, let's just say white to black. And you'll notice when I do a linear gradient, I have this angle option here. So I can either set these things this way. I can also use the gradient tool over here to rotate things and move it. But in this case, I know I want to go like 90 degrees. Sure, we'll have it go from pale to dark. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my opacity here from normal. I could just say multiply, right? I could also try some of these other options. I could do an overlay, and you can see that, again, that makes some pretty significant changes. Color burn might be interesting, who knows? But so, right, so I think you get the point, right? We can create multiple layers, have them overlap. Again, right now this is actually sitting on top of the stroke, but you can't really see it because because the stroke is totally solid black. So I'm just going to drag it under the stroke. But then with the stroke, again, right, we can make a lot of different changes to this. I could add an arrowhead to it. We could make it a dashed line. We can, change the opacity of this, distinct from the opacity of the other object. Again, lots of options. We can have multiple strokes. So I could have this dashed line. I could create another stroke. Again, this one is solid, and I don't think is it dashed at this point? It is dashed as well. Let's go ahead and make this solid, but say instead of being black, let's go ahead and change this color to yellow. And then I can drag this stroke down below the other stroke and maybe change my opacity here back to 100, just so it's really vibrant, right? And so now I've made caution marking symbol just by using two strokes on top of each other. They don't need to be the same width either, right? So I could set this one to 14 points or something like that, and then it'll expand around the edges of it, right? So pretty easily you can take any basic object or shape and you can do a lot with this appearance panel in order to add visual complexity to it. And we haven't even talked about effects. There are all sorts of different effects in here. One thing it does is it tends to rasterize things. So if I was to say, I don't know, rough pastels on one of these, and then maybe zoom in, you'll see that what it's doing is, because I have the stroke selected, it's actually doing this rough pastel texture on the stroke. When you do this, it does rasterize it. So it makes it so it's not a vector anymore, which can be problematic, and it's just something to be aware of. We're not going to deal with effects too much in the class, but let's say if I did actually select one of the fills, let's select this bottom one, and let's go ahead and do rough pastels on that. Let's see here. Where was it? Well, I've lost it now. Artistic. Let's do paint tops. I don't know. And I don't know if this is actually going to show up in any way that's interesting or not. You can kind of see it there. It's actually doing some really weird things. Let's go to fresco. Right, so you can see you can add some other additions to it. But again, this does vectorize the artwork. And so that's something to note. So if I hit OK, it makes some changes, and it is this sponge effect that gets applied on top. So what's nice is I can turn it on and off. If I select it, it brings me back into this setting, and I can adjust, the brush sizes, and definition and smoothness and all of that there, and then hit OK to make those changes. All right, so again, lots of variation that you can do in there in terms of creating unique appearances pretty quickly in Illustrator. Okay, in the next tutorial, we will actually look at duplicating things and a couple different methods for creating multiple copies of the same object, because repetition is always interesting. And so that's going to be the next tutorial.